Welcome back, folks. We are up to topic 6.6 in the APUSH curriculum, the rise of industrial capitalism. We're going to look at some pretty famous businessmen and different business models in this topic. And we're focused on how the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898 led to socioeconomic changes. Let's see what that means. So the first thing we're going to look at is so-called integration and trusts. And we're going to look at some leading tycoons. And what the heck is a tycoon, right? Well, tycoon is just a businessman, right? A fairly famous businessman. And we're going to look at all three of these men a little bit today. They're three of the most important, most famous businessmen in all of American history. That is Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, John D. Rockefeller of the oil industry, and the most famous banker in American history, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. All right, let's get into this, guys. So we're going to look at two different business models. The first one is the one preferred by Andrew Carnegie, and it's called vertical integration. So what vertical integration means is if you manufacture a product, you want to have all phases of the manufacturing process in one company. Okay? In other words, you want to have the mine. If you're building steel like Carnegie was, you want to have the mines. You want to be able to ship the stuff. You want to be able to make it and sell it. Every stage in the manufacturing process you own. That way you're not paying a third party for anything, because that cuts down on your profits. By having everything in-house, you are maximizing your efficiency and maximizing your profits. Again, that's called vertical integration. The second model is the one Rockefeller preferred, and it's called horizontal integration. And what horizontal integration is where you buy up rival companies in your industry to the point where you have basically all the companies, or at least enough of the companies to have a basic monopoly on that industry. So Rockefeller would buy up smaller oil refineries and turn them into one big one called Standard Oil. Okay, Standard Oil was his famous oil company. So as a quick review, vertical integration, you're buying basically all levels of production you can see here. So you're maximizing your profits. And then horizontal, you're simply buying up things in the same industry to form one big company. All right, now, as these companies developed, what they would do is they would form a new type of company called the trust. And the way a trust works was you would have a single board of directors. Okay, so you have these executives, they form a board of directors, and they own stock in a bunch of different companies. Enough of each one of these companies that they effectively control those individual companies. And then what they do is they operate those individual companies as a single unit called an interlocking directorate, better known as the trust. Now, that's a lot of information. It sounds very probably a little confusing. So when you think of the trust, guys, just think of a big business that controls businesses. Okay, it's a business of businesses. Okay, I know that sounds really weird, but again, it's a single board of directors. They own a bunch of different individual companies, and they operate them all as one. In other words, let's imagine I owned Walmart and I owned Target. And if I operated those together as a single unit, I would have one trust, right, where both of those companies functioned. Now, trusts were very efficient. I mean, because they operated as a single unit, because there wasn't as much competition anymore, these companies are going to make a lot of profit. And pretty much every one of the big industries in America had a trust to it. There was a leather trust, a sugar trust, a barbed wire trust, meat trust. I mean, you name it, there was a trust in that particular industry. Now, these trusts, because of their big business nature and the wealth that they produce, they could also be very politically powerful and influential. And that's what we see in our cartoon here. It says bosses of the Senate. Notice how our senators are not really independent-minded people. Instead, they're looking back to the trusts. What are they thinking? What do they want us to do? You can see all the different individual ones. And you'll see it says entrance from monopolists. And this one over here says the people's interest, people's entrance, and it is closed. Okay, this is a sentence of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. So does competition between companies hurt or help consumers? And the answer is it helps us, because when companies compete, prices tend to go down and the quality of the products tend to go up, because these companies want your business. They compete to produce better things at better prices. Do trusts help or hurt competition? And of course they hurt competition, because if you buy if all the businesses in a particular industry are controlled by one business, then there is no competition really going on. This brings us then to a reaction against the trusts. It's called the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And this made illegal so-called combinations and restraint of trade. In other words, combinations of business that restrain trade and competition were now going to be illegal. However, this Sherman Antitrust Act, even though it's revolutionary for its time, it really didn't live up to its potential, because it was never really fully enforced, and there were all kinds of loopholes that were built into it to allow trusts to continue to operate, even though technically they were a trust. Also, businessmen who are scared of this antitrust law to begin with eventually came to the conclusion that they could use it for their own devices, because they claimed that unions were combinations and restraint of trade, right? It's a combination of workers, they're getting together, and that reduces trade and competition, so therefore labor unions should be illegal. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act was then used against its original intent to go after labor unions. Now we're going to look at this idea of these tycoons. Were they robber barons or captains of industry? And that's the terms they used back then. Obviously, if you think these people are greedy monopolists who only care about their bottom line, you see them as a robber baron. If you see them as, something to look up to and aspire to, as an example of the American success story, you see them as captains of industry. And like most things in life, it's not black or white, it's gray. So let's look at a couple of these tycoons. First is Andrew Carnegie. And, honestly, Andrew Carnegie really does kind of live the American dream, in the sense that he was born into, pretty rough economic circumstances in Scotland. He came to America as an immigrant, and he started at the bottom. I mean, his very first job, he earned just a little bit more than $1 a week. He worked in a mine. He worked in a telegraph company. He worked on railroads, and he did a lot of the dirty work at the bottom of these companies, and he worked his way up through hard work and determination. And eventually he went into business for himself, and he found the steel industry to be the future of American industrialization and capitalism. And even though Andrew Carnegie himself didn't know a whole lot about steel, what he did know is how to hire the best people. And Carnegie would surround himself with brilliant business minds and great organizers, and before you knew it, Carnegie Steel was producing 1/4 of all U.S. steel, and he became the wealthiest person in America. Now, speaking of wealth, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, is, as I said earlier, the most famous banker in American history. This guy had a lot of money, and he wasn't satisfied. He wanted even more money. And so in 1901, what he does is he offers up to Carnegie $480 million for Carnegie Steel. Now, what that means is basically Carnegie is, going into retirement, I guess you can call it that, I suppose. And now for $480 million, J.P. Morgan is not only the most famous banker in America, he's also the #1 steel producer in America. Pretty big stuff. Now, to understand what Carnegie does with his money, we need to talk about what a philanthropist is. So philanthropy, what is philanthropy? Well, that simply means basically giving money away. That's what philanthropy is. It's raising and giving away money for good causes. And Carnegie we're going to look at this a little bit more later, so I don't go into too much detail right now, but Carnegie believed that the wealthy people had a responsibility to give back to the community. In other words, Carnegie, he would have never been wealthy if people hadn't bought his steel, so he felt kind of an obligation to help the people out. And so he's going to give away something like $350 million of his fortune. And again, when I say $350 million, I'm talking like 1800s, 1900s dollars. We're talking, I mean, the equivalent of, I don't even know, $1 billion maybe, a lot of money today in modern dollars. And including his most famous contribution was to establishing libraries. His money is going to build over 2,500 libraries around the world. And his belief was that if you build libraries, it will give people a chance to get more education, to better themselves, maybe go to night school or something, to, work on your degree and kind of, get that next rung of the ladder up, And so he thought, I'm not going to just give you money directly. I'm going to give you the tools so that you can make money. Now, as an interesting note, I will say about the Carnegie libraries is Carnegie wanted to make sure that these communities were serious about getting his money for building libraries. And so he would pay for the building on the condition that the town would buy the books that went in them. So he's not actually buying the books, he's just building the building. And a lot of these Carnegie libraries are still out there. This happens to be the Carnegie Library in my hometown of Defiance, Ohio. I believe it was built in 1901, if my memory serves me well, and it's still very much a library today. All right, now, as I said, Morgan had purchased Carnegie Steel, but he already owned other steel companies as well, and he kind of combines them into one big trust called the U.S. Steel Corporation, or just U.S. Steel for short. And this was the first U.S. corporation in history to be valued at over $1 billion. Now, remember, $1 billion is 1,000 millions. And we're talking a time period where $1 billion was a number that was pretty much unimaginable. It's almost like if I said $1 trillion today. You can't even imagine what that even looks like. So this was a mega corporation, U.S. Steel was. All right, what about John D. Rockefeller, our final tycoon? Well, he got in the oil industry pretty early on when it was really coming into its own. And he established a company called Standard Oil of Ohio in 1870. And he was a really aggressive businessman. He believed that, competition for business supremacy is like almost like a war, that you're going to take no prisoners and, just drive out the competitors. And so one thing he would do is, as he was expanding his oil company outward, as he came into a new territory where another oil company was in existence, he would approach that oil company and basically, hey, I'll buy you out for X number of dollars. And typically the company would refuse, like, well, I don't want to be bought out on my own company. And Rockefeller would say, well, okay, that's fine. And then what he would do is he would move in that territory and he would sell his oil at just cutthroat prices. Like he would take a loss on the sales in that area. And what would happen is the other company he was trying to buy out, they couldn't compete with those low prices, and they'd be basically driven to the point of breaking. And then Rockefeller would walk in once again and say, hey, I'd like to buy you out. And then they would, out of desperation. And so he was just gobbling up oil companies left and right. Remember, he's Mr. Horizontal or integration. Now, Rockefeller made so much money that he became the wealthiest person in the world. And, adjusting for inflation, some people still consider him the richest person ever. He was a billionaire when very few people were millionaires. He was incredibly wealthy. And because of his wealth, there were a lot of people who felt that he was simply too powerful, that maybe he had too much influence over the government and over the economy itself. As a side note, I will mention this about John D. Rockefeller. He was obsessed with longevity. In fact, he especially later in life, he became focused on this goal of living to be 100. Now remember, this is a time period when life expectancy was significantly lower than it is today. If you lived to be 65 back then, you were considered elderly. And so to live to 100 is, I don't even know what the equivalent would be today, 120 or something. It would be just insane. And he almost made it. He died in 1937 at the ripe old age of 97. His grandson died back in 2017 at the age of 101. So the Rockefellers must have some pretty good genes. All right, so let's look at this idea of robber barons or captains of industry. Remember, robber barons is a negative connotation, captains of industry, very positive. So on the robber baron side of things, we can say that, some of these tycoons did some pretty shady business deals. Sometimes you were bribing lawmakers or judges to rule a certain way or to pass a certain law. They can be involved in buying votes and rigging elections. And the journalists and newspapermen who should have been keeping them accountable were often paid off. And one way they could pay them off is by giving them free railroad passes, right? So in other words, you're not going to criticize a railroad which lets you travel on it for free. I mean, can you imagine if you were able to fly free on any airline you wanted, just wherever you wanted to go? You would love that airline. You wouldn't dare criticize them because you don't want to lose that privilege. On the plus side, though, on the captains of industry side, there's no doubt that these men created, untold numbers of jobs. Americans who otherwise wouldn't have had a job or, wouldn't have had a real chance, had a chance. And, Carnegie himself showed that if through hard work and determination, you could work your way up the system, right? He came from nothing and became a billionaire. And so why can't other people, right? So people got an opportunity in his businesses to move up and have a better life. The overall economy of the United States grew by leaps and bounds because of these business tycoons. And remember, a lot of them gave away a lot of money. We talked about Carnegie and his libraries, but John D. Rockefeller also gave away a lot of money, especially to his church. And so, if you're going to use your money wisely, I guess that's a really good thing, especially if it's going to help other people. All right, guys, that's the end of our discussion on industrial capitalism and how it's changing, leading to socioeconomic changes between 1865 and 1898.